This is Dennis Ramundi and my co-host, Phil Goldberg, author of American Veda, Spirit Matters, spiritmatters.com. Our guest today, Dr. Charles T. Tart. He is executive faculty at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology in Palo Alto and professor emeritus of psychology at UC Davis. He is internationally known for research with altered states, transpersonal psychology, and parapsychology. His 13 books include two classics, Altered States of Consciousness and Transpersonal Psychologies. Dr. Tart, thank you so very much for taking the time to come on our show today.
It's a pleasure to be here. I think we're going to have an interesting conversation.
Okay, let's begin with this question then. You've been sort of straddling this line that most people think can't be crossed with your interest both in spirituality and science. You're a rigorous, disciplined man of science, and yet you have interests in subjects that most people of science dismiss out of hand. What's it been like being on the front line of this for all these years?
Well, the analogy you introduced that with, Phil, straddling it, kind of amuses me with a certain black humor thing, right? I can see myself with one foot on spirituality and one foot on science, and sometimes it looks like they're going to get further apart and I'm going to plunge into some kind of abyss, whatever. I never say that word aloud. It's been difficult, okay? I mean, it's also been very exciting. I am convinced that we have a real spiritual nature. As well as, you know, we live in a real material world, and science has done a fantastic job at learning more about the material world. But unfortunately, that's tended to be coupled with a dismissal of the spiritual as if there's absolutely nothing to it and it's crazy to be interested. But yet, insofar as the spiritual is real, which I have no doubt about it, when you dismiss that aspect of us, you create all sorts of suffering. We're not whole anymore, and we get crazy ideas.
Dr. Tart, let me ask you about that. It's fascinating to me, and I'm a guy that, has a long background in meditation, given a lot of thought to this stuff. But, certain fundamental things I'm still not clear on. When you say spiritual, is that defined as anything that's non-material, or is spiritual a realm unto itself that incorporates also certain aspects of materialism?
Now, I've got to discipline myself here to not get carried away, because I can give you a long lecture on how the word spiritual or the word meditation is used in so many different ways, many of them contradictory.
Yeah.
They're almost useless words, okay?
Yeah.
Let me put it this way. I define a strict materialism as saying reality is nothing but material things and material energies, and they bounce around and give them a few zillion years and we're here, but it doesn't mean anything. Something like meaning has no place in a totally materialistic approach to science. Not that I'm against materialism for investigating material things. If my car breaks down, I don't want somebody to pray over it. I want somebody who knows how those parts are supposed to fit together. But we need meaning, okay? When people have to feel that their life means something. If they don't feel it means anything, and that's what materialism tends to do, say, that there's no meaning inherent in reality, they get sick in various ways, and they may try to distract themselves or lose themselves in pleasure, but, what's going to happen on your deathbed when you start reflecting, well, I got some things and I lost some things, and it doesn't mean a damn thing. Versus spiritual in a very general sense now of it is meaningful to be a human being. I'm part of some kind of greater process. There's something about intelligence and wisdom or love or something like that as part of that process. And my life may not have been spectacular by material standards, but I've learned to be compassionate or wise or help other people and the like. And so my life has been meaningful. That's the kind of general distinction I'm drawing. I'm also strongly distinguishing spiritual from religious, okay? Spiritual to me talks about having certain experiences which deeply change your view of reality. And then the committees get hold of it and decide what you're supposed to believe and not believe, and you'll go to hell if you don't believe it, and we better modify it so the king will approve of our organization and whatnot. We need religions. We're social creatures. We need organization and whatnot, but they tend to lose track with the actual spiritual experiences.
Charles, a lot of people who are spiritual practitioners, a lot of people in religion, a lot of people who are in the spiritual but not religious camp, also are frustrated with scientists and materialists in general not taking spirituality seriously. You're in another category where you've done actual rigorous research in phenomena that you think provide evidence of a non-material or spiritual reality. So it must be doubly frustrating to you. Can you just sort of shed some light on the research you did?
More than doubly frustrating, quadruply or even more, something like that. Well, let me give you a concrete example. Years ago, my wife and I were talking to our babysitter once, and she knew that we were people it was okay to talk about funny experiences too, and she mentioned that ever since she was a little kid, it was common for her to wake up in the middle of the night sometimes and find herself floating near the ceiling. And she could look down and see her body in bed and whatnot, and then she'd fall back asleep. And, she'd always wondered, was this real in some sense, or was it just some weird kind of dream? And was there something we could do to find out about it? Well, now, if I was a really kind of orthodox materialist, I would have said, this woman's got some kind of psychopathology going on, or neuropathology. Her body image is getting screwed up. She's having hallucinations about where her eyeballs are and the like. But I knew that people have had experiences like this, and sometimes they even can tell you what's happening at some distant place where they think their mind is gone, even though their body's at home in bed. So I said, well, let's find out for yourself whether you're really there in some sense up near the ceiling, or it is just an interesting kind of dream. I told her to take 10 slips of paper, write the numbers 1 to 10 on them, and put them in a box. And after she'd gone to bed at night, without looking, reach over and shuffle them around in the box and feel herself turn one over so it was facing up. And then if she happened to float near the ceiling in the middle of the night, memorize the number and check it out the next morning. Well, I saw her a few weeks later, and she'd said she'd done it 8 or 10 times, and she was always right about the number. Was there anything else interesting we could do?
Wow.
Well, I said, yeah, and I'd been doing sleep research for years at that time, so I had a laboratory where I could measure her brain waves and the like, and because I was really curious. Although near-death experiences hadn't come out of the closet way back then, I knew about them, and I knew that one fairly certain way to make this thing happen was to almost die. So what was happening? Was she having some kind of seizures or heart attacks or something in the night? So she spent several nights in the lab, reported several out-of-the-body experiences. I found a unique brainwave pattern going along with them, and I was very happy with that because as far as I knew, this stuff had already been talked about as something that might happen once in a lifetime for some people, but I demonstrated what was important, namely that you could take a weird thing like that and start studying it more precisely in the lab. And it was important because obviously the idea of a soul comes from people who felt they've been out of their body in their soul someplace else. Now, the other thing that made it especially interesting, and this created innumerable grief for me, is I said, okay, and after you go to bed each night, I'm going to come in the room with this folder, and without you being able to see it in the bed there, I'm going to slide a piece of paper up on this shelf right near the ceiling, and it's got a 5-digit randomly selected number on it. If you happen to float out of your body, not only should you wake up afterwards and tell me you did it, but memorize the number. Well, she only reported once that she was in position to see the number, and she correctly told me that 5-digit number. Now, the odds are 100,000 to 1 against guessing a 5-digit number. Now, here's where the grief comes in. I wrote this up as this is a suggestion that in some sense her mind is really out. It's perceiving the world from a different location. But just a suggestion, and much more research is needed, right? The academic mantra for all papers, more research is needed.
Right.
But that article of mine, which has been around for 30 or 40 years now, gets attacked so often, and people attack it as if Tart said he proved the reality of the soul. Hey, I just said you could study this in the lab, and there was an interesting thing that might have been paranormal there, but you don't prove anything with one experiment.
Wow.
So, you get all sorts of irrational resistance to this.
Wow.
But I think science is a great way for refining knowledge, and it can be applied to the spiritual, to internal experiences. It hasn't been done much at all, but we can do that and learn a lot more about what the spiritual is, how it interacts with the real world, the physics. I slipped there when I said the real world, right? My brainwashing, it's only what physical is real, caught me. How it interacts with the physical world, okay? I felt very lucky to have found somebody who could have an out-of-the-body experience at will like that.
Dr. Tart, I'm curious. I find this stuff extremely fascinating. And I'm wondering, you got involved in this way before it was in any way popular. Was there some spiritual... Yeah, still, it takes a long time, maybe centuries, but was there some spiritual experience you had, or was it something you read? What triggered you? What was it in you that that inspired you, that motivated you to do research in this area?
Well, this is where I disappoint people, because I'd like to be able to say, one day God appeared to me and said, young man, you're going to grow up to be a scientist who studies brainwaves and out-of-the-body experiences and telepathy and stuff, but it wasn't that exciting. But what did happen, and which is relevant, though, is I was raised as a Lutheran, very conventional. My grandmother, who was the source of all love, took me to church and Sunday school, and what was good enough for her was good enough for me. And then I got to be a teenager, and like teenagers, I saw adults were hypocrites. They didn't live what they preached. I really got interested in science just because it was just so darn fascinating, and saw that a lot of claims of religions didn't fit with science. So I found myself in a conflict that I think a lot of people go through. That on the one hand, it says science has proven that all that religious and spiritual stuff is a lot of crap, and it probably means you're crazy. So I was very lucky, though, because I came across this very old literature on what was then called psychical research, where people back in the 1880s had said, why don't we apply the methods of science to the spiritual and psychic and see if we can begin to sort out what's real and what's not real. Because, there's a lot of craziness under the name religion and spiritual, like there's craziness in all fields of life. But can we refine our knowledge? That's what I've been doing ever since. And, to me, there's more than enough evidence now, not just from my research, but from the small number of other people who've done this, that to me there are some kinds of psychic phenomena that can form a basis for taking the spiritual seriously, that is so well proven, so well documented, that I call them the Big Five. No reasonable person could doubt that they exist. Now, of course, that's because the materialist atheist defenders against heresy say I'm crazy and a fanatic and whatnot. But these are things like telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, psychokinesis, psychic healing. My last book, The End of Materialism, really talked about the Big Five, as a basis. One example, prayer. Okay, from a materialist view, if you pray, what are you doing? You're talking to yourself. End of story. People with a kindly bent say it might be good for you to talk to yourself and have these nice delusions that some daddy figure in the sky is going to take care of you or something like that. But there's nothing to it. But wait a minute, we have lots of evidence for telepathy, that sometimes one person's thoughts can be picked up by somebody else. They could be halfway around the world. Well, wait a minute, we got a carrier mechanism for prayer for it to get somewhere? Interesting possibility, Doesn't prove that all prayer is telepathy or, that it isn't crazy sometimes and the like, but suddenly this total a priori rejection of something like prayer becomes questionable. And, then there are other things. There's evidence that we might survive death, that we can be out of our body, as in that experiment I described and so forth. That gets very interesting.
Now,
let me just put a cap on that, okay? I mean, in 400 pages of detail or more in that End of Materialism book, the conclusion I basically reached is that to think that science has disproven the spiritual, that there's absolutely nothing to it, is factually wrong. And if you actually look at the evidence, it's reasonable to be both spiritually oriented and scientifically oriented in your life. Of course, there's still lots of nonsense around. You got exercise discrimination and all that, but you're not stupid if you take the spiritual seriously.
Right, and you would think that a genuine scientific attitude would be to be open to these possibilities, especially where there's reasonable evidence pointing in a certain direction. And that's where people like you have made a distinction between science and scientism.
Yes.
Maybe you could explain that.
Yeah, some people think I coined the word scientism, but I didn't actually. Sociologists coined it back in the early 1900s, and what they meant by that is that proper science is supposed to be open-ended, right? You don't have the truth in science. You have theories, understandings of how something works that works out pretty darn well. It can predict what's going to happen next. But that's subject to change if new data comes in that doesn't fit. But when you do something that we humans do all the time, that is, you love success and you start to get complacent, it's like, oh, we know the truth. We have scientifically discovered everything important. And that's scientism. It acts like a fundamentalist religion, You say something happened that doesn't fit my idea of what science has said about the world, I don't have to look at your evidence. You must be wrong. But that's not science. That's scientism.
It's an ideology.
Yeah. Dr. Tart, I wanted to ask you, I'm curious, you one of the areas that you research is altered states. I assume altered states of consciousness. What's the relationship of altered states of consciousness to what is often described in Eastern religions, Eastern teachings as enlightenment, higher states of consciousness?
What a nice, simple question.
Yeah, in 25 words or less. Yeah. No.
Yeah. You probably use a word processor, okay? Probably something like Microsoft Word. And if you keep track of things, you probably use a program like, say, Microsoft Excel, which comes up with tables with formulas in them and all that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Get the idea? Mm-hmm. Okay, which one is the superior or more true program?
Right.
It's a stupid question,
Yeah.
They do different kinds of things, and one is superior for certain kinds of things and not very good at all for the other kind of thing.
But I guess my question is you in human evolution, from your research, do human beings seem to be growing toward a particular state of consciousness that evolves over time and over millennium, and is the altered states related to people achieving aspects of that in that process, or not?
Boy, I wish I knew the answer to that one. I certainly hope we're evolving. Mm-hmm. But, the altered states in general, they're like different programs to run in your brain or your mind, and they're better for some things and poor for other kinds of things. When you talk about enlightenment, something I've been thinking about for a long, long time, one of the things you could say is that sometimes people have certain experiences which they feel give them a very deep glimpse of the truth and which have profound effects on the way they live their life. Now, a lot of time, like scientism, they then get attached to that particular understanding and think they've got all the truth that matters. Mm-hmm. They might call themselves enlightened. Whether somebody else would consider them enlightened, I don't know. What I've tried to say is we need to study various altered states of consciousness and find out what's good for what. There might be states of consciousness that are great for going to a church or to a meditation retreat or something like that. They're lousy for balancing your checkbook. I got to update that example. Nobody balances their checkbook.
Right, that's over, yeah.
Yeah, well, okay, I'll think of
We know what
something.
you're talking about, yeah.
But in one sense, then, enlightenment would be knowing what state of consciousness it would be best to be in for a particular kind of situation that comes up, and having the skill to get into that.
Mm-hmm.
I like to use a tool analogy. You know, if you hired a carpenter to remodel your house and the carpenter showed up with one tool, you'd begin to wonder, it's a very shiny saw. It'll probably cut things very nicely. What's he going to do when he has to put nails in?
Right.
So in that sense, a more enlightened person would be someone who had various modes of conscious functioning, various states that they could apply skillfully to particular kinds of problems, and also know what not to apply. And one of my biggest mistakes, for instance, is I'm a very intellectual person, and so people would sometimes tell me about their emotional problems, and I'd give a brilliant intellectual analysis of what they should do, and then wonder why they didn't follow my advice. Because I wasn't really in the kind of feeling state to really understand what was going on at that emotional level.
One interesting side question to this is the experience we think of as an altered state, as opposed to or compared with the classic sort of experiences that are described in the yogic texts and in the Buddhist texts as beyond thought, as transcendence or pure consciousness or shunyata. Do you, in your categorization of these things, distinguish between those kind of states of consciousness in the text that are without content, without objects of perception, and altered states as defined some other way?
Well, no, I don't do that, Phil, because basically I have not experienced those states myself, nor do I have several dozen friends who have experienced each one of those that I can talk to at great length about exactly what it is they're experiencing or not experiencing. I just don't know enough to make those distinctions. So to me, they're interesting suggestions. Maybe they're the literal truth. Maybe they're not. I don't know. I'd certainly like to see us study those things.
Right.
I'm also very leery of deciding ahead of time you can't understand something, because as Henry Ford is supposed to have said, those who think they can and those who think they can't are both right.
Right. Dr. Art, I'm curious. You've been at this research for many years, before anybody I know. Maybe 20 to 30, 25 years ago, Deepak Chopra started speaking about a lot of the same stuff, was able to get himself popularized. Do you think what his work, what he's been doing, has been helpful in what you've been trying to accomplish and achieve, or has it not been helpful?
Well, it depends what day of the week and in what situation you ask me.
Right.
Okay, because we're talking about not just the particular work per se, but it's the way it's been received and the like. So, there are scientists who say, oh, yeah, it's good he's reminding us that there's this interesting stuff to look at, and others who say, oh, this mystic, he's ruining our idea of science and whatnot. The long-term judgment's going to be made by history, not by me.
Charles, you probably know Houston Smith. You both live in Berkeley. He famously said years ago, when I think during the psychedelic era, that altered states are one thing, but it's altered traits that really matter.
Yes.
Could you? I know you probably agree with that.
Well, yeah, and let me flesh that out a little bit. G.I. Gurdjieff, who's one of the spiritual teachers who's made a lot of sense to me, and guided some of my own personal work, talked about how we have several different kinds of intelligence. He called them brains, because that was the fashionable word. but like he made a distinction between parts of us that process things intellectually versus those that process them primarily emotionally versus those that are kind of an instinctive body sort of level. And he talked about how these things can go wrong. So he talked, for example, about the weak yogi, the person who, in a sense, knows everything. They talk a fantastic spiritual game. But if you look at the way they live their life, they screw up as much as anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
Now, being a college professor, I was a weak yogi for most of my career, and I know thousands of people who are weak yogis. You know, you do too. They talk a fantastic game, but how do they live?
Mm-hmm.
To begin to recognize there are other kinds of knowledge that have to be developed is a major developmental step. See, I don't know what enlightenment is. Okay, but I have a pretty good idea of what endarkenment is. So anything that makes you less endarkened is probably movement in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the best definitions I've heard after all of these years hearing about and discussing this stuff. Dr. Tart, in your own life, are there spiritual practices, or is there a spiritual practice you partake in?
Oh, I'm what's the phrase a friend of mine coined? I'm a fundamentalist eclectic when it comes to spiritual practices. I've done a very wide variety of things, well, some of which I think have been valuable and helped me understand myself and change, and others of which probably I totally wasted my time. It's learning to come up with practices that fit the situation. Okay, let me give you an example, okay? I'm going to go back to this weak yogi example. Years ago, I saw an example of Aikido, this Japanese martial art that's based on a principle that love and harmony is a fundamental aspect of the universe. But since there are a lot of people who are pretty out of harmony, you do need to practically be able to defend yourself. Well, I saw demonstrations of it and thought, this is great, and arranged for a black belt instructor to come up to UC Davis to start teaching students, and I became the club sponsor so I could train too. And it was fascinating because in about 3 weeks, I could explain Aikido much better than my black belt instructor. I could talk about the physics principles involved, the philosophies in it, the spiritual traditions from which it was drawing, and so forth. But I kept noticing that while I had a black belt in talking, I couldn't actually do a damn thing when it came to Aikido. He kind of tossed me across the room with his little finger. And it slowly dawned on me that there are different kinds of knowledge, and just because you have a good set of words doesn't mean you actually know something worthwhile. It took me several years to learn to pay attention from my body, as it were, and pick up that kind of knowledge. Now, and then here's the interesting thing about it, to tie it back in with other stuff. I've done Vipassana as probably my main form of meditation practice, although in varied forms. And one of the things I'm very good at in Vipassana, where I say my aim is to be more present of what's actually happening in the present moment, I've had many experiences of having great fantasies of being present to what's happening in the moment. And, 5 minutes later, I realized I've been daydreaming the whole time, but I'm actually paying attention to what's going on now. Then I realized Aikido had become a very novel form of Vipassana for me, because it became Vipassana with immediate feedback. Okay, I stepped out there on the mat, and if I was having a daydream, a fantasy about, hey, I'm a martial artist, I'm pretty damn good, my partner's grabbed me already, and I can do the technique, but it's kind of ragged and rough, versus if I'm actually paying attention to what's going on now, moment by moment, I can be harmonious. I can blend with my partner, do this technique very smoothly. I kept getting immediate feedback thousands and thousands of times of, have I just been daydreaming about being present, or have I actually been reasonably present? That was wonderful. I wish there was some way to do that in formal Vipassana when you're sitting down and drifting off into fantasy, and something could tell you, oh, that's a nice fantasy, but you're not paying attention to your body sensations or breathing or whatever anymore.
Well, maybe would you say that your own spiritual practices have helped you deal with the resistance to your work among your colleagues with more equanimity and humor than you might have otherwise?
Oh, yes, and thank goodness. I didn't know how much that had happened until once I'd given a lecture somewhere, and somebody came up to me afterwards and said he had been to several lectures of mine, and they were about stuff like parapsychology, where you get some really hostile people in the audience. And he said he really liked my technique for dealing with irrational hostility. And I was very puzzled. What technique? Do I have a technique for dealing with it? And I thought about it and realized I was applying Aikido to that. It was on a verbal and emotional level, but I learned to sense the quality of the energy coming from the person, to not get angry or attack back, but to kind of blend with that in a way to understand it and then redirect it so the person would be neutralized in a sense. The attack wasn't effective, but they had a chance to see something about themselves or learn something. Oh, wow, that Aikido really does work here. I needed to do it. I've put up with a lot of crap.
I'll bet.
Yeah. Dr. Tart, we have a couple of minutes here for a few more questions. I wanted to ask you, I mean, I have in the last 20, 30 years, have your audiences, has the academic world become more receptive to your work?
That's a very hard question to answer, because I've tended to just interact mainly with the small part of the scientific world that is interested in things like this.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, I was a consultant on the remote viewing stuff that was done at Stanford Research Institute for years, and that was supported mainly by intelligence agencies, not by academic science.
Mm.
And there were some very outstanding practical uses of ESP in that case. And let me just say something there, because I know some people are going to say, oh my God, he worked for the military. When I was initially asked to be a consultant on that, I had the same feeling, that sounds pretty sleazy. I don't think I could do that. So somebody explained to me, most wars start because one side figures it can surprise the other. And when you have good intelligence and you can't surprise the other guy, a lot of attacks simply never happen. That's helpful. It's not an ideal situation, but it's pretty good in this practical world.
Charles, you were there at the birth of transpersonal psychology, and I hate to remind you of this, but that was really happening almost half a century ago.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Phil.
Well, I hate to say it, but I remember it too. But now, all these years later, when transpersonal psychology first rolled off the sort of assembly line from Esalen to the Bay Area and so forth, there was great hopes for that. And all these years later, there were institutions devoted to it, and you were part of that. How would you assess the progress in that bringing the spiritual dimension into the discipline of psychology?
Well, that's a complex thing, because in one way I'm very disappointed. We did not get numerous institutions devoted to researching spiritual knowledge and separating the wheat from the chaff and finding out how to apply techniques more effectively and so forth. And that way I'm disappointed. On the other hand, a lot of the ideas that were mainly in transpersonal psychology at that time have started to seep into the mainstream. So, for example, meditation is now considered an important part of psychotherapy. Mm-hmm. Now, it's meditation light from our perspective, And, I got nothing against people learning to relax better and handle stress better. It's not quite the same thing as seeking enlightenment. So it's a very mixed picture that way, It's a failure in one sense, and it's been quite successful in another sense. What history's judgment is going to be on it, I don't know.
Dr. Tart, I hope this is the first in a series of interviews we'll be doing with you. This is Dennis Ramoney and my co-host, Phil Goldberg, author of American Veda. Our guest today has been Charles T. Tart. He's a PhD and executive faculty at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology in Palo Alto and professor emeritus at UC Davis. He's internationally known for research with altered states, transpersonal psychology, and parapsychology. His 13 books include 2 classics, Altered States of Consciousness and Transpersonal Psychologies. Charles, what's your latest book?
Let's plug Charlie's latest book.
Yeah.
The End of Materialism, an important book.
The End of Materialism, available, I assume, on Amazon.com. A book I'll be reading soon because you really stirred a lot of curiosity. This has been fascinating. Good. And I'd love to talk to you more about it.
If I can stir curiosity, I've fulfilled my dream as an educator.
Great. Thank you so very much for
Charlie.
coming on today.
Okay, it's been really fun talking, and I'll be glad to go on again some other time. There's a zillion things I'd like to share before I pass from this world.
Great.
Thank you.
We'd like to ask and learn. Thank you.